The 7 trumpets are given to them, but they aren't ready to sound yet. There'll be several verses later before they sound. But as we think about it, a lot of what we've been looking at has been symbolic. So what might trumpets symbolize? What kind of things were trumpets used for? Again, thinking in the Old Testament. All right, so to signal the arrival of somebody or someone or something. Announce things, right? And so if there was a special announcement that needed to be made, you would gather the people with the trumpet, or the trumpet would have caused everybody to stop what they're doing and pay attention. Right? So announcement or even warning would be the ideas probably behind these seals. These things are being announced or being warned. In the Old Testament, trumpets were used to call to battle, were for celebration. And here's where, it might also tie back into the fall of Jericho in Joshua 6. What was the procedure for the Israelites to do to get the walls of Jericho to come down?
They had to march around the whole city and be absolutely silent. Then the day after going around 6 times, you have to go around one more time and be all moved down.
Yeah, so there's 6 days of silence, and then on the 7th, after 7 times, shouting, and the walls came down. But that silence isn't exactly right. And that's how we've always been taught. But when you look at the text, there's actually some noise going on during all of that. The trumpets are blowing constantly. The people are making no sound, but the trumpets are blowing constantly. Y'all have looks of disbelief on me. Chapter 6 of Joshua. Yeah, that's the part. It sounds a lot better to talk about silent and then you shout, right? So, Joshua chapter 6, beginning in verse 8. Or actually, let's back up a little bit to get the sound. Beginning in verse 1. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out, no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and its soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priest blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout. The wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead." So Joshua gives them this command. Verse 8. As Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. All right. Verse 10, to the people Joshua gave this command, "You shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So the ark of the Lord went around the city, circling it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. And so the people were silent, but they were blowing the trumpets the entire time. Now you're going to go back to your VBS teacher and say, "You taught me false doctrine." They were blowing trumpets the entire time. It wasn't absolutely quiet. But this idea of the silence and the trumpets, probably part of what's behind here is this the silence and the blast of trumpets, the shouts. There's also a lot of things in here that are connected with God showing Himself to the people on Mount Sinai. There's a lot of thunder, lightning, quaking, the blast of trumpets, all of that as well. And so there are a lot of things as we go through this passage that will probably say, hey, that sounds kind of like what happened on Mount Sinai. So the 7 angels are given 7 trumpets. And then another angel steps forward with a golden censer. Now, the censer would have been something carried by the priests to take incense around. Would have probably, most cases out of gold, and then hot coals would be put into it, and then incense on the coals, and it would produce smoke. And so this angel comes forward with a golden censer. He comes to the altar. Right? This is the altar, of course, that probably we saw in chapter 6 when the fifth seal was open. Right? The soul's under the altar. So he comes there to get the fire, and he's also given a great amount of incense. Not just a little incense, a great quantity of incense, or much incense, I think is the translation that Matt was reading from. And he's offering the incense with the prayers of the saints. Now notice this time it's the prayers of all the saints. The last time we really seen anything to do with prayer, it was the souls under the altar who had essentially given their lives for God. Now, with the way that it is worded here in chapter 8, it could grammatically be that the incense and the prayers are two separate things. He's offering incense with the prayers of the saints. Or it could be interpreted as the incense is the prayers of the saints. That probably is the better understanding of this, because if we look back at chapter 5, verse 8, we see also incense, particularly the 24 elders holding bowls of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And so in that case, the incense is the prayer of the saints. The incense, of course, was often offered with sacrifices in the Old Testament to make them acceptable, or was connected with their acceptability. So even if we understand this as two different things, what's being presented here are the prayers of the saints. And those two are being presented on the altar. Now, we've already talked about this when we were in chapter 6. It seems like this altar that John sees in heaven is both, it has qualities of the altar of burnt offering in the temple as well as the altar of incense in the temple. Right? There were two altars in the temple, but there's just kind of one that serves both functions. And so as the angel offers this incense, the prayers of the saints, the smoke of the incense rises before God. Now, what's all of this symbolizing? What's going on here in explaining this symbol? What is this meant to communicate?
Prayers are a sweet aroma.
Okay, our prayers are a sweet aroma. I mean, there's other passages, especially in the New Testament, we could find that. What else do we kind of think about what this is communicating?
By him giving him all of this quality of attention, he's standing in for the rest of the saints.
Yeah, it's kind of like, he's been given all the prayers of all the saints, and he's kind of bringing that to God. Some people have suggested because of that this might be Jesus, even though it's referred to as an angelic being. I think it just means an angel, but that idea of going between human beings and God, kind of an intermediary there. But he's the one that's presenting the prayers to God. I mean, when you think about it, have you ever wondered how your prayer gets to God? I don't think that it's specifically like this, but it's symbolic of our prayers being presented to God, and in a sense also God accepting of the prayers. Now remember, a lot of these prayers are dealing with people that are being persecuted. And God is formally accepting their prayers. And maybe accepted because of the sacrifices they're giving. And so I think that's why there's silence in heaven for a half an hour. Is that everything is kind of stopped as the prayers are being offered up to God. Here too, another Jewish tradition said that the angels sang all night and were silent during the day so that God could hear the prayers of the saints. So this idea of kind of heaven stopping while prayers are brought before God. Now, I think that, of course, probably says a lot more about our prayers than we often think of. We might wonder, does God hear my prayer? With everybody else in the world that's praying. But the idea here that, especially those early Christians, God knows what's going on. He hears what you are saying. And He's come before Him. And that language of, the coming before Him presentation is language that has been used throughout the Old Testament. If you think about when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, right? I have heard the groanings of my people, and I have come down to answer them. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has come up to me. Right? And so this idea of the presentation of these prayers, these requests, being made known to God, and God stopping everything to pay attention. Once the prayers are offered to God, the angel then takes his censer and fills it with fire again. But this time, it's not to offer the prayers of the saints. What's it for this time? It's to throw down to earth. It's for judgment, right? And so he takes it again from the altar. Now I think it's important here that he's saying from the altar. Because one of the things, if you go back and read Leviticus, if you read Exodus, the altar was made holy. Anything that touched the altar was holy. And so the fire coming off of the altar would have been holy as well. But it is a holy wrath that we are seeing now. The fire that is coming is the fire of judgment. God's wrath has been averted, but in this case it's serving as the substance of His judgment. And so the fire and the holiness is all connected here. Go ahead.
Would this holy fire also be a direct result from the prayers of the saints that we just read about?
Yeah, I definitely think that this is kind of a response to those prayers as well as the prayers from the fifth seal. Right? How long is it going to be? Yes. And I think that definitely is kind of a result of that.
Could it also be the promise that He will restore the earth in more than one of the
Yeah, I mean there are warnings about the fire that God would use in judgment as opposed to the flood, for example, in Genesis 6. And I think here that this throwing a censer to earth, is kind of this what has happened in heaven with the offering of the incense and the prayers will have consequences on earth. And the other thing to think about as well is that we again have some of these echoes of God appearing on Mount Sinai, which was connected with fire and rumblings and all those kind of things if you go back and look at Exodus 19. And so when the censer hits earth, there are peals of thunder, there are rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake that takes place. Again, don't take this very literally, because you could say, okay, what is this censer? Is it kind of a meteorite? No, I don't think that's what it's saying. Nor do I think this is a warning of a literal earthquake. But the idea here is great judgment coming. Right? God's power, God's consuming fire being expressed here, and judgment, specifically kind of the judgment that is getting ready to take place. God has kind of had enough, and now He is starting to bring that judgment. The other thing to note here as well is that with this phrase, peals of thunder, rumbling, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake, is a repeated phrase that comes up several times in Revelation. Not 7 times, but it comes up 4 times in Revelation. Yeah. There's 4 here and 4 times as well. But note what happens each time. So the first time it comes up is in chapter 4, verse 5, in talking about the throne. So from the throne come lightning, rumblings, and thunder. And we talked there about this kind of expression of God's power, God's majesty. Here in chapter 8, verse 5, it's thunder, rumblings, lightning, and an earthquake. In chapter 11, verse 19, it is lightning, rumblings, thunder, earthquake, and heavy hail. So what's going on? It's getting worse. It's kind of building, right? And so it starts off, it's still, earthquakes are bad enough, but it's kind of building each time. The last time is in chapter 16, verses 18 through 20, and there you have lightnings, rumblings, thunder, a violent earthquake unlike any other, is the way John describes it, and huge hail. And so each time these words come up, it's getting worse and worse and worse. The judgment is continuing. Behind some of this, as kind of a foundational passage, I'm sure it will astound you to know that there's a passage from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 10. Now, we've already mentioned this part of Ezekiel in chapter 7 when we were talking about the sealing of the 144,000 on their foreheads. God has taken Ezekiel to the city of Jerusalem, shown him all sorts of immorality, adultery that has been taking place, and then sends a man with a writing case through the city to mark everybody who is weeping and wailing over the immorality, and then sends people out to destroy them. And so that's kind of where we were when we talked about the 144,000. But note this similar language in chapter 10. So if somebody read chapter 10, Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 1 through 7, please.
Then I looked, and behold, on the expanse that was over the heads of the cherubim, there appeared above them something like a sapphire, an appearance like a throne. And he said to the man clothed in linen, "Go in among the whirling wheels underneath the cherubim. Fill your hands with burning coals from between the cherubim, and scatter them over the city." And he went in before my eyes. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the house when the man went in. And a cloud filled the inner court. And the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house. And the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. And the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court, like the voices of God Almighty when he speaks. And when he commanded the man clothed in linen, "Take fire from between the whirling wheels, from between the cherubim," he went in and stood beside a wheel. And the cherub stretched out his hand from between the cherubim to the fire that was between the cherubim, and took some of it and put it in the hand of the man clothed in linen, who took it and went out.
Right, so a similar kind of situation. Lots of differences, right? The angel gets it from the altar as opposed to from between the cherubim here, but this idea of taking of the fire of God and casting it over the city in judgment.